welcome, Rob, and thank you for accepting to do this thought leadership video series about the valuation multiplier, where we move beyond trends and into the frameworks, discipline, and the leadership systems that really drive enterprise value. My name is Nuno Godinho. I'm co-founder and CEO of My Fractional CEO. And thank you, Rob, for making the time today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me, Nuno.
Fantastic. So this is our opening conversation. So we're opening this series with a conversation that's not about the AI headlines, but about generative AI and its real impact in executive level. So what are boards doing? What should CFOs, CEOs, and COOs be thinking about? And how do we turn AI from a pilot project into valuation leveler? Rob Connell is here with us and is a multi-continent operator, investment advisor, and growth strategist who's implemented, reviewed, and advised on Gen AI at C-level. So this isn't abstract. This is a decision-making clarity powered by data and grounded in governance. So let's get into it. So Rob, what makes Gen AI different from any of the past waves in tech, like cloud or mobile, especially for the executive teams?
Yeah, I think it is important. Let's look at those differences. And I think it's also important sometimes to learn from similarities as we've adopted other technologies as well. So first of all, I would start by saying, yes, there is a lot of hype, but there's also a lot of pragmatic things that we can be doing across organizations. So we are looking at this quite strategically. We are, as you said, looking at this at a board level, and therefore we need to think about how that is being adopted across organizations. It really is thinking about who are the movers and shakers in your business that might already be using Gen AI. And a few listeners, probably not many, but I had been doing a podcast series on Gen AI for business leaders with a couple of colleagues who are, quite frankly, day to day working with a much broader group of companies than I am at the moment. I'm working with some companies in very in depth, but they've been working with corporates and SMEs as well. And one of the things we talked about quite a lot is what's new. And there's always something new and hype and all the rest of it. But also what was important is what is actually being implemented well and being used. Then at a board level, what's being sanctioned to be used and what are the guidelines being put in place from a safety point of view, from an adoption, from an efficiency, productivity point of view. That's a lot of subjects all rolled into one there. But one of the things that we talked about a few times is if you look at something like open source software, which is, I know from your background in the tech world, Nuno, as well. I mean, I remember reading things like board mandates saying we do not use open source software in an organization. And then he actually went and spoke to the IT department. It's like, oh, what do you mean? No, 90% is being invented already. So of course we're using open source and we already have open source in our software, etc. So they'd missed the boat. And I think it's a little bit like that sometimes with Gen AI as well. It's already being used, whether the board realizes it or not. So at the most simplest level, when you're using predictive text on a message or whether you're having suggested response. I just responded to someone on Gmail this morning and it was a one-liner. I was in a hurry. The one-liner looked perfect. So I just clicked on it and send. And to me, it didn't look like an obvious Gen AI answer either. So we are using it. So that's important. So I think the first thing for any board is to think about setting some guidelines. And that's really important. And that's related to such things as confidentiality and decision making. And what I mean by decision making is use Gen AI in the same way that we've always used business analytics and data in the past to make an informed decision, but don't use Gen AI to make the decision. Create some options, create maybe some wider thinking, etc. If it's something related to, for example, something like HR, I wouldn't rely on AI, use it as a prompt. That's really it. Now, the other things that the main differences are, the big differences are things like making sure these guidelines are in place. Now, we might have had guidelines for using things like open source software, but that wasn't making a decision for you. So those guidelines on not using AI purely for decision making is important. Those guidelines for if you're using very public resources about what confidential information you put in or not. And reality is when we're talking about enterprise level, it's going to be secure. It's going to be your own solution effectively, which is good. And for the smaller businesses out there, I'll quote one of the leading people in the whole data security space, who's one of the founders and directors of with Secure, who basically said the likes of Microsoft and Google, etc., have got access to your information anyway. So I think he answered a very paranoid question from me in terms of if you're using something like ChatGPT, do you really want to put a real name in or something like that? And reality is they could get access to that somehow if they wanted to. And they're not going to do that from a reputational point of view. So let me very quickly summarize. At a board level, the first thing is look at guidelines and let people innovate, let people use AI, but give them some boundaries.
And absolutely agree with that because it gives you speed. It gives you ability to exponential learning and get, as you said, much more understanding and much more data points for your decision. Just don't use it immediately to make a decision. And also, you mentioned the open. Yes, it's not about coming from a place of fear. It is better for you to go and say, okay, yes, we can use, but here's the limitations. In open source. You had different licenses. So yeah, we're not going to use a license like this, and we're going to use LGPL or whatever. In here is the same thing. When you're going, oh, we're not going to use the free versions because that is being used to train. We're going to use paid versions, but you need to do something because, as you said, if you don't, then you're going to get surprised because someone will be using in some part, might be the IT team, might be the sales team. People are using this normally. And so it's really interesting because one of the pieces is where have you personally seen Gen AI deliver operational ROI? And where is it that you still believe that it's kind of a vaporware?
Yeah, I think that's a good next step. And if we look at adopting AI tools and automation and agents, etc., and we do need to look at it across the organization. Sure, it's a bit like in the days when I remember going to a Gartner Business Analytics Summit a long time ago, and they were quoting something like 90% of all business intelligence, business analytics um, projects failed. And the reason they failed is because they didn't involve enough broad section of people across the organization. So you have to look at how to adopt AI and where it's worked, where there's been a return on investment for the sales function, the marketing function, the HR function, the finance function, production, customer care, and look at what works and what doesn't work. But also you do, I would say, in the same way that Gartner at that time was saying, you need to have like a executive committee of people looking at business analytics across those different departments. I think it's the same for AI or Gen AI as such. If you're adopting these tools, you need to look at AI regulations, which is going to affect how you're handling, for example, customer records or something like that. You'll need to be looking at other compliance risks around that. Sure, maybe there's some ethical frameworks in place, and it depends on your industry. So sometimes I do some work with medtech, for example, and you have to think about patient information and the protection around that. But then we can look at things. I can look at things where it's worked really well already, and I can certainly see some areas where it can be greatly improved. So I think marketing is a great point in terms of creating images and creating content in terms of being able to cut things down to the right number of characters, all those sort of things that massively speed things up. That's brilliant. So there's a load of great stuff for marketing and things like today. I'm looking at my notes and, we can apply an AI tool here to make sure I've actually been looking at you all the way through and maybe getting rid of my teacup, all that sort of stuff. So marketing, there's loads of stuff that it can do, and it feels relatively safe space in terms of giving people guidelines. Sales, I think, is a little bit more complicated. And I don't know about you, but I've got quite cheesed off with a lot of AI generated messages that look so similar across the board. So I think a bit like marketing, you can use it to improve, polish, and automate, but not to replace entirely. You really need to keep some human aspect to that. Customer service, I know a brilliant company in Finland that sold their their chatbot to a very large health provider here, and that works super well. But I can give you lots of examples of terrible chatbots. Finnair, for example, sorry to call them out here, but they recently had a lot of industrial action, and you just couldn't get through to anyone, and their chatbot was really not fit for purpose. And indeed, a lot of their onlines. The reason being because their online services wouldn't now allow you to do some of the things that they said you could do, i.e., change your flight at no cost because of industrial action. So you have to talk to someone. So when a company has become so reliant on automation and they still need people to intervene and they don't have enough staff, then you're going to leave people even more dissatisfied. But having said that, there's some fantastic examples as well of chatbots working really well in customer service. Now, so the sales, marketing, customer service, one thing. Now, finance is another area. I have had a bee in my bonnet for a long time about poor cash flow tools, for example. And I think that we are going to see some much better tools coming out with the use of AI, Gen AI now, because historically it's been historical data, right? And I think with Gen AI, it's going to get much smarter in terms of forecasting, and that will help with the boardroom planning and reporting and generating pretty reports very quickly. That certainly helps. I mean, I've worked with an army of people in data analytics and visualization, etc., and you can do so much now. The other thing is legal. I think legal is a massive area. I didn't mention legal earlier. I mentioned compliance. Legal is fantastic now to be able to go through very long legalese documents and be able to summarize them, for example. And again, not to rely on it. You still need to have someone with real legal knowledge, but also looking at things like case law, etc. That's brilliant. Looking at things like patents, if you're looking at innovation and, room to maneuver. That then gets us into things like product management. And I'd certainly like to see more automation around finance. And I've talked a lot in the past about finance not being bookkeeping, but more about financial planning, etc., and scenario planning, which you can do more with Gen AI. Then keeping everybody informed with good visualization very quickly, not spending a lot of time having to do that. Yeah, product management is an area that's quite interesting. And I think also if we look at things like RDI, or research and development, one of the colleagues I was doing the Gen AI podcast with, it actually came from being a VP with about 50 reports where they were creating these Horizon type applications. Very time consuming. Now with Gen AI, just amazing what they can do. Really is seeing a huge return on investment for things like grant. Here we are in the EU, or I am at least here in Finland. And but if we look at things like grant applications, which is, let's face it, Europe is much more reliant on for things like funding, that's really helped with Gen AI now. Really good. I recently did I did a workshop for a group of startups as well, and that was very interesting in terms of looking at their product market fit, being able to create a magic quadrant, looking at competitive intelligence, competitive analysis. All of these things are very good to do. Anyway, I'm rambling now. You might want to rein me in. Yeah.
Yeah, and but I love the passion because I agree with you with the financial planning, and it's about giving more time for people to do the things that are critical, which is the critical thinking, because it gives you more time on those pieces, the automation, and you have then the bots, you have the AI agents, you're now agentic AI platforms, and all of this. But it's at the end of the day, as you say, is about you defining what you needed to do. And also, I absolutely agree with you on marketing, legal. It helps everywhere. You just need to properly train it and start using it, because a lot of people go and do very simple prompts, and it's getting more and more important for you to understand what you're doing. You've been in rooms where this goes from a board discussion to then the execution, which sometimes is where challenges come and it's another change project. So let's go into the C-suite leaders actually activating Gen AI without breaking things. So what's your strategic framework for evaluating where to deploy Gen AI across functions?
Well, the board will need to make sure that tools and budget time is set aside or resources set aside for addressing skills gaps. And sometimes when you're looking at addressing things like employee concerns, like skills gaps, you can make a mountain out of a molehill. And I think it's important, therefore, to take some baby steps in terms of bringing in sponsors, bringing in thought leaders, bringing in someone who really will, who's drunk the Kool-Aid about Gen AI, and can come in and wax lyrical and all the rest of it, but then be really practical. So we talked about all those different departments. So each department should have a game plan in terms of what tools are available for them and giving them some training. And I think that's really important. And I don't think it's that extensive. I mean, these are pretty intuitive tools to use now as well. I think one thing is not to spend too much time. You don't have to go through long RFP processes, etc., for these tools now. They're relatively cheap, right? So I think you can have, okay, sure, you might have the IT or group IT supporting you on adopting and putting those tools in place, but it's not something that's going to hold things up. And then once you're in there, I think you need to create some champions, even if they're learning as they go along, which is what we're all doing. I mean, you see these adverts sometimes for X number of years of experience when you know that the solution's only been around for 2. So let people break things as well is another one I would say. So find champions, let people experiment, let people break things. Yeah.
It's that piece we're all learning, and if someone says they're an expert in AI, it's just by the fact they're putting that broad, it's already an indication. So go and try to get it and test new things, get champions, people that are really passionate about it, and then go and think what is your value risk matrix that you're going to use in order to select those things, and scoring with, of course, the compliance overlay. Now moving for CFOs and boards, what type of due diligence is most critical when reviewing AI vendors pitches? Because there are so many out there. So how do you support, and what do you think CFOs and boards and CEOs should be thinking when doing the due diligence?
Yeah, well, you just mentioned vendors pitches. So I think if we're talking about preparing to receive investment or to make or if you're making investments, the due diligence list doesn't change in terms of technical, legal, operational due diligence on a firm. Preparing your documentation should be quite faster. So, for example, if you haven't done it for a while or if things are a bit out of date, you can create templates very easily. You can present numbers, etc., more neatly. If you're receiving that information and you're looking at the pitch information, okay, you said vendor pitch. Sorry, I was probably going off, but whether you're looking at an investment, raising investment, talking to your bank, talking to, looking at M&A, or indeed, yeah, if it's a vendor pitch, you're looking at selecting a company to use or not. It's vast in terms of someone might send you a lot of documentation. You can summarize it very quickly just by uploading the documents into ChatGPT, for example. You can then ask for things like competitive analysis, pricing analysis, and obviously it's a web search once you're going outside. So it might be limited to the sources that it can see. There are still databases out there that, for example, investors will use that is not public. Yeah. So you find the real price of a business that's up for sale, etc., rather than the undisclosed sum. But in general, you can handle a lot more documents and summarize them very quickly. And if you need to create those documents, you can create templates and you can create sort of a straw man very well nowadays as well. And I'm using my words a little bit carefully there because you need to polish and finish and check everything. So I only think of it as a straw man still.
Yeah, and it's good. So, for example, I use it every day with the paid versions and everything, and it's great. Even if you're talking with someone, you receive as you say, the mountains of information, and you leverage the research capability, deep research, and either ChatGPT, Perplexity, Gemini, or anything. That gives you summaries, gives you some more information much quicker for you to understand what's important. But even when you're going for these tools, is understanding, am I going for a Gen AI tool from OpenAI, Google, or am I going to some tools that might seem very cool, but it's a company that I don't know anything about what they're doing with the data. They don't have any information. So it's important. And you talked about champions. So, how can CEOs be the champions for Gen AI across teams without becoming either a bottleneck or a bystander that would get them in trouble in any of those situations?
I had a conversation with a colleague this morning who was actually studying doing a PhD in AI, and quite an interesting topic. He's actually looking back at how AI generated the results. We're working with a client, which I can't disclose, but it's quite interesting because he's been helping them with AI adoption. He's also been helping them with, revitalizing project management, a lot of data analytics work. But what we're starting on next week is he's going to be working across their organization, not as training AI, not as a coach on AI, but a mentor on AI. And I think that's quite interesting because that will allow people to discuss their opportunities and fears as such around it. And he obviously can, in a coaching style, ask them right questions, but as a mentor, he obviously can give opinions, etc., as well. And it's always an interesting battle between training, coaching, and mentoring. But I like the fact that the organization really were keen to have him as a mentor on AI. And maybe the CFO is one of those people, but maybe there's a mentor to the CFO and a mentor to the CTO and a mentor to the COO, etc., as well. But my view on the CFO looking at AI is I think it is going to be about making it easier for the data collection, the data analysis, the data visualization. And, we talked about this, Nuno, a while ago. It's like, I remember going to an organization, they just didn't know which products or which customer segments were doing well for them. And I think the CFO would need to go back and make sure that their building blocks are in place. Do they have everything set up correctly in terms of, when they're sending out an invoice, are they sending an invoice knowing, what are the product lines, etc.? So some basic things like, if things like all the accounting codes, etc., the chart of accounts is set up correctly, then you can take that raw data and you can do a lot more analysis with it very easily now without having to buy Power BI or something.
Yeah, and it's that acceleration of being an AI champion. But I love the concept of the mentor because there's definitely a lot of questions. There's self-proclaimed experts. I would be very careful because um, what today is the best in there. Tomorrow there's a lot of changes, so we need to always be careful on that. But it's having some way in order for you to have the conversations, discuss your fears, and say you can try this, try that is fantastic. So let's now stay at the strategic level, but at the capital lens on it. How should boards and capital partners approach this responsibility? So, from your perspective, in what ways is Gen AI already changing the enterprise governance and auditing structures through either audit trails, data lineage, and so How do you see this changing already the enterprise governance?
That's a great question. I'd love to put that to the auditor that I use. It would seem to me that in practice, people haven't really adopted it so much, or if they have, they're keeping quiet about it. I've not, and one of the things with Gen AI is it's not about people losing their jobs and all that kind of stuff. It's about doing more with what you have, right? Everything's growth, right? All the boards are there to increase the return on investment, increase the shareholder value, the dividends, etc. That doesn't mean, cost cutting left, right, and center. Hopefully, it's actually looking to drive revenue and profitability. So everything is about doing more with less, and that means certainly the financial governance and good governance in the business means that the reporting, etc., should be coming through. The analysis of that should be easier to do, but you should also just be able to get deeper into it so that you can set the direction further. Going back to a little bit to what you were saying earlier in terms of these so-called experts on this, I think of this a bit like when you look at something like a journalist, for example. So there's so much going on. The journalist will keep up to date with who's the new mover and shakers, what are the new AI tools, etc. But they're not executing stuff in a company at operational level. So you have to be careful about the noise. Yeah. And you do need someone, when you're looking at a specialist, it's good to find someone who's got empathy and knowledge of your domain and your business as well, so that they've got the context of what's going on. So if we go back to your question in terms of, strategic use of AI and financial and good governance, obviously a public limited company, they've got a great deal of reporting going on. I think that's going to speed things up and make it more accurate. Smaller businesses can raise the level of reporting that they're doing, and the boards themselves can be making better informed decisions. And then I think we can think about the board structure. So do you have someone on the board, not necessarily as a ready-made Gen AI expert, but someone who'll champion Gen AI and is willing to learn, right? Attitude is one of those things, and adopt it and use it. Yeah. And can influence other people.
And so someone that might not be an expert, but it's passionate, but it's already knows enough to be dangerous and to ask the right questions, because there was a lot of those elements that are needing to be challenged. And the audit structures is the reality is, from my perspective, as you said, maybe they are using and they are keeping quiet. I think that's a lot of what's going on, because there is still a blurry of what exactly do you need to do. But this needs to be sorted, because, for example, you have in Europe, you have the AI Act, so you have responsible AI. You need to understand what you've been doing, so a kind of audit trail, which is important. So moving on that, because the geographies treat it differently, how do different geographies, for example, UK, EU, US, Asia, treat Gen AI adoption culturally and structurally? What's your experience been like in these different?
So I think we have companies working in different geographies as a domestic market. We have people working in different countries who operate internationally or are multinational, but they might have an underlying culture from their originating country or something related to the industry sector that they're in. So I've done a bit of work in fintech and insurtech, for example. I've done a bit of work in medtech, well, just lots of different industries, and they all have their own way of looking at things as well. I think for the multinationals and the country and those who work with export markets, etc., Gen AI has been absolutely amazing. So when you get lots of legal documents in foreign languages, and you still might need an official translation for certain things, but you might be, for example, here in Finland, you have to file your accounts in Finnish, but a lot of technology companies here are operating in English, and indeed they might have an overseas owner. Yeah. So being able to translate things in seconds really helps. In terms of the attitude towards the adoption, I think a lot of this also comes down to what's being done anyway and kept quiet, as we just talked about, and is often related to the hierarchical structures by different countries. So in Finland, again, and I won't talk too much about Finland, but in Finland in general, from education through to being in a company, it's flat. People's voices heard. You can challenge, you can say no more easily than perhaps someone like the UK. And then I think it gets even stronger in the US, gets even more hierarchical, dare I say it, almost dictatorial sometimes. Yep. And then if you look at somewhere like Asia, where it's super polite, there's so many rules of engagement, where people might agree to the adoption but not do it, because of the way the hierarchy works. I would say, with any country, try and throw away, as always, your positive and negative prejudices. And when we're talking about something as fundamental as the day-to-day tools that everybody will be using in the business, anyway, you make sure that people feel safe to innovate and to be able to speak up and say, yes, they get it, no, they don't get it. And then they give them the appropriate training, mentoring, etc., to use it. So in short, without sort of going country by country, that would be the rule for every country. Some countries people are going to naturally push back anyway and ask for help. Some people will push back and not ask for help. Some people won't ask for help. And you just need to make sure that you create that. It's like creating an innovative business. It's the same for the adoption of Gen AI. You need to create a culture where people want to embrace it and they're not scared. They're not scared to say, I'm a laggard. I don't know what's going on here. Please give me some help. I'm willing to learn.
Yeah, and that's the important part is it's not different from any other thing because it comes from your culture, company culture. Is it a culture where people are okay to talk about and say, I need help in here? Or are they going to be trying to hide the fact that they are using that because there is fear in the culture? So that's always impacts. And as you said, getting the champions, getting the support, creating the focus on the culture on one end, but on the other hand, also understanding the regulatory compliance that it needs to be. And so as we've looked across the boardroom, this is an important is the board needs to understand that they need to give this to everybody and start supporting them, because if they don't, then they are going to use it on their own in an environment that might not be as controlled as you'd like, and that's where you get in trouble. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to add one point. Sorry. I've read a lot about, and I haven't witnessed this, but I've read a lot that the EU regulations are too stifling for corporations and that the US is a bit more wild, wild west. And what I would say from a good board governance point of view, I don't think they're too stifling. I think that it's a bit like with GDPR, it's sometimes the interpretation of it and lack of understanding. But if you understand things like the EU Act on AI and you embrace it, you adopt it and you work around it and you work with it. Now, you look at countries that aren't governed by that. If you look at countries like Singapore, for example, they will often go by the EU standards as well. So look for the highest standards, no matter where you are, and follow those highest standards because good chance it's going to come into law where you are anyway.
That's a great advice because I agree is they make you think. I think it's not about being stifling, but it's they make you think, they make you have the audit trail, they make you understand what is being used, which is absolutely critical for you, because if you don't, then how are you going to have responsible AI? How are you going to understand why did it get to that information? So that's a critical point. And so as we shift from the boardroom, and now let's close this by talking a little bit about where are we heading towards. So what do you think that C-suite look like in 2026 if Gen AI adoption scales as it's expected?
Back when we were at school studying economics, people would talk about things like perfect competition, right? And we were told it doesn't exist. But it's getting to that point where you're not going to have, you're going to be in a situation where you can really get a good idea on your competitive landscape and what's going on very quickly, which is always important. A really good understanding of your competitors, really good understanding of your own products. And these sound like really basic things, but I've worked with boards before who could not define their value proposition, couldn't tell me in one sentence what the company actually does, right? And then you look at some amazing leaders out there who get it. And think about when you put a CEO into a large organization that needs to improve profitability or, wake up and modernize or, or overhaul their products or overhaul their whatever's going on. I mean, think about people who go in, those good leaders normally go in and look for efficiencies across the business. So what's his name? Is it Luca Di Maio? I think he's just left. Yeah, one of the he's worked with all the big car manufacturers. It's not really my industry, but he's just worked, and he's now gone into luxury goods. But he goes into a business, and he's typically there for 5.5 years, and he turns them around in terms of he looks for efficiencies throughout the business. And they're not just talking about cost cutting. He looks for efficiencies. But he's also looking at new product development, new customer segments, and he turns those companies around in that space. Now, I'm not saying everyone can be him, but I think a lot of people can be like him in terms of he's worked in companies with hundreds of thousands of employees sometimes, right? But I think you can go in there and you can have so much data at your fingertips and so many tools. You don't necessarily need a big team around you to go in and do this. Most of these people will have a chief of staff, for example. Yeah. Which I think is important for a busy CEO, by the way. I think that's a really underrated role. Yeah. Okay. So, in summary, the stuff that these really good leaders do that come in and really look at everything going on in the business and look for every area of efficiency, new product development, etc. I think there's a lot you can do now based on almost like desk research and getting documents from all these different departments and trying to analyze them. And hopefully, I mean, let's face it. Remember, Nuno, the first time you sat on a board, right? And you probably, I don't know if you're anything like me, you go in there and you're so well prepared because you're nervous first time. You don't want to make a fool of yourself. So you've read everything. You've planned for every scenario question that you might be asked. And you sit in there and you listen to some of the questions and answers. And you think, hey, these guys aren't that special. And your imposter syndrome goes away. Yeah. But now also there will be things that people from different departments will be using terms you think, I have no idea what that person's talking about, right? And I love the fact that just some basic Gen AI stuff where you can get descriptions for things. So going back to the finance again, for years we've had great automation for P&L reports and income statements and for all the KPIs. But I would say that 9 out of 10 people in the boardroom don't actually understand all those financial KPIs, right? So they knew what their, acid ratio was, but did they really, and they knew what maybe the norms was, but did they know the norm for their industry? You know? So those sort of things you're so empowered now. So it's maybe not perfect competition is how I started the conversation, but we're getting closer to it.
And I agree. There's a lot of it enables to raise the bar on knowledge and innovation. But also, as you mentioned before, there is a need for what I've been seeing as kind of chief AI officers or chief AI strategy officer or chief future officers coming in, because now with more data, with more activation, the perfect uh, the business and all of that gets into by allowing more businesses to do the strategic foresight,
Yes.
because it allows you from looking just to the history to the next level. And those are some of the blind spots that most executive teams have today, and they are still underestimated. Are there any other ones that you think there are still today that they should be focusing on, some of those blind spots?
I think it does come down to no matter how wonderful tools we put in, no matter how well people are informed, really would just repeat. You need to create a culture of embracing leadership, empowering people to be leaders. And what I mean by that is letting people challenge, because we can much more rapidly enter the boardroom with good knowledge of what's going on. So we can focus, as you say, on strategic insights and, thinking about going forward. but you've got to allow people to have a voice.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So Rob, thank you for cutting through all this noise. As you said, it's not about whether we adopt or not. It's about when, where, and how it aligns with actual business models, capital structures. So, to everybody listening, please follow Rob Connell on LinkedIn. Subscribe to this Valuation Multiplier by Rob Connell because we're going to have a lot more. And let's continue talking about this. And next time we'll go deep into scaling international and why global go to market can break your valuation if done wrong. So thank you very much, Rob, for this, and look forward for the next.
Thank you for guiding me through it, Nuno. Many thanks.
Thank you very much.